Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Bald Explorer live reading. And we are reading The Story of a Norfolk Farm. We were reading A Cack-Handed War, but after two sessions, we decided that we would give up on that one. So we're going to read a different book. This is by Henry Williamson, who wrote Tarka the Otter. And I don't know what the difference between Ring of Bright Water and Tarka the Otter are. Two different books, aren't they? I think they're both about otters, if I remember rightly. Oh, change of book. Yes, question mark. Yeah, I was struggling with the reading and I wasn't overly enjoying it. So it's an interesting book and I do recommend it as a book, but I think he writes in a way that is, well, for me, it was just difficult to read aloud on the fly. And I don't have the time to pre-read and prepare. I was doing that to begin with, but when I started with the English, whatever it was called, English Journey, but I've just got so busy now. So we're reading the story of a Norfolk farm. I shall start the story again. I read a couple of paragraphs, but I will start the story afresh for those people who come to it afresh, if that's okay. So this is by Henry Williamson, and there's a couple of quotes here. I don't know whether this is worth reading or not, but at the beginning it says, "Going to farm, my dear fellow, whatever for, don't touch it. You'll lose money. Farming's dead in England. Everyone will tell you that." And that's from the British Everyman in 1936. And another quote here, "We count it a privilege to live in an age when England demands that great things shall be done, a privilege to be of the generation which learns to say that we can give instead of what we can take. For thus our generation learns there are greater things than slothful ease, greater things than safety, more terrible things than death. That was by Sir Oswald Mosley in March 1936, which prefaces the book. And I'll give you the author's note as well, which might be just worth interesting. "I regret that it is impractical in the present time to publish this book as originally written in the period between the spring of 1937 and the summer of 1939. An author writes a story, but is not entirely free, in some circumstances, to persist in his personal wishes for its final or original form. The publishers have told me that certain passages, including an entire chapter, are not essential to the story of the farming venture, and they are likely to excite a controversial interest at odds with the main theme of the book. I have therefore decided to remove them, hoping that they may be restored to the text in the happier and healthier age following the end of the war." That was written on the 11th of November 1940, and I'm just trying to work out when this was. We said it was 1941 when it was published. So clearly this was just before the Second World War. Good afternoon to everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for coming. I haven't really started. I've got a coffee on the go. And I'm going to reread I read a little bit, a page and a bit, I think, yesterday, just to try it out and see what we'd. I'll start again in case there's people coming to this completely afresh, if that's all right. So you've not missed anything if you are already late. Hope you can hear me all right. So chapter 1, I go on a journey. One dull day in 1935, I went to. So that's interesting. 1935. So he's writing this book 5 years later. It's just sometimes it's worth just, pulling out those facts as they suddenly occur to me. This isn't the story of a lifetime of running the farm. This is a story of 5 years of running the farm and the things that go from it. So that's quite interesting. One dull day in 1935, I went to London in my open car, which I loved. It was painted black and all the seats were covered except the driver's, in which I sat as in the cockpit of an aeroplane. There was a sense of freedom in my car, which had a silver eagle as mascot on the radiator cap. It was fast, doing 85 miles per hour when flat out, and it covered 24 miles to the gallon. These mechanical facts interested me, as once the precision of the words had occupied all my time. I had bought this car after some literary success following the publication of 2 books, one about an otter, the other recounting what befell a revolutionary ex-soldier called Madison, who strove against the pre-war minded and suffered greatly. Both these books had made some impression in the small literary world of London and New York, which hitherto had not taken much notice of my writings. One old gentleman, the husband of a famous poetess, who knew or had known all the celebrities of the 90s and the Edwardian epoch, expressed surprise when I went to visit him driving my fine new car. Fancy the author of The Pathway, of all people, caring for things mechanical, he said. Are you safe with it? Won't you go daydreaming? And in the end up in a ditch? He seemed to be serious in his affectionate concern. Perhaps his experience with a poet who lived destitute on the Embankment by Charing Cross and whose verses were now classical had led him to believe that the better the poet, the poorer the man of action. What was it, beside drugs, that made Francis Thompson so inept a man, so great a poet? I've thought a score of times about it, about his lack of natural love experience, his unhealthy, inactive life too. But no, I only know for certain that such men are born to sing, and not to be big businessmen. A ploughman, yes, or a carpenter, but never a man keen to make money in the competition of the marketplace. Never a farmer. It was with such idle thoughts that I drove across Salisbury Plain by the way of Stonehenge and the ruins of the hangars and the hutments of an age long since passed into history, an aerodrome of the Royal Flying Corps of the Great War. Oh, that's the hutments of an age long since passed into the history. The aerodrome of the Royal Flying Corps in the Great War, the heaps of bricks and the rusting iron laying in the midst of the long yellow grass of winter. I saw them out of the corner of my eye, and I touched my flying helmet in salute as the eagle roared forward at a steady 70. I like to think of the ghosts of that faraway time idling serenely in the grass, playing crown and anchor, or trying to crank up one of those great 60-horsepower Mercedes cars, which some young pilots of those days used to fit with 40-gallon tanks, of course, at the government's expense. 1 month a bank clerk at 20 bob a week, the next a pilot at 25 bob a day, the open sky by day and the Piccadilly Grill by night. It was curious how time slipped away. As the first rain since Somerset chilled my face, I saw myself going down to Devon after the end of the war on a motorcycle driven by a rubber belt from a wide metal pulley. How it had rained! The journey had taken 14 hours. It was March, and I had set out from London without an overcoat. There had been money for both food and petrol. Juice in those days was expensive, nearly 5 bob a gallon. The rain had lashed down, and the belt had slipped. But I hadn't cared for the wet or the mud. I was free, and this wasn't the rain and mud of the Somme or Passchendaele. Grand feeling, causing one to shout and sing as the wet trickled down the small of the back and around my stomach. A smear and blur of time, and here I was, perhaps making my 100th journey across the rolling grain plain and dropping down to Thruxton, where the wilderness began to end, and soon I would be at Handover and among the increasing traffic on the London road. It was dull after Andover, and no longer an adventure. Dangerous to go too fast, too many corners. I disliked going fast here. I longed to know someone along the road, to call in and feel the warmth of welcome. But I knew no one. Hotels were dull. I didn't stop for tea, but went on, fixing my mind on the lighted bar of the Barbican Club, the Adelphi Terrace, my base or home in London. I was in my 40th year. During the 17 years in the West Country, I had written about 20 books and become the father of several children. During the writing of the first books, time seemed to go slowly, yet seldom dully, and then somehow it was going fast, faster and often dully. I told myself that I was lucky to have escaped into middle age. My sort of writer, almost useless for anything else in life except digging himself and turning feelings into words, usually came to an unhappy end. If it wasn't tuberculosis or starvation, it was suicide or drink. Whereas I, despite several phases when I thought I must be really ill, had sound lungs, plenty to eat, too much tenacity to kill myself when things went wrong, as they usually did, and as for drink, I loathed much of it. It made me sick, and then all the heart went out of me. It was time to leave the West Country. I needed new impressions, new stimulations. With the exception of the Salmon book, which was first class, the last 3 or 4 books I'd published, while as good as most country stuff, were not much good, although in time students would find delight in finding out about the author from the pages. With what joy and eagerness... Hang on, let me just start that again. These pages are paper thin. Bank, I think they're called. Bank is about 60 GSM. With what joy and eagerness had I found a new Jeffreys in a second-hand bookshop. That'll be Richard Jeffreys, whose grave I went to see in one of my videos recently, funnily enough. With eagerness I'd found a new Jeffreys in a second-hand bookshop in those days of London in 1919, when working for the Times, canvassing advertisements from suburban auctioneers. Usually a first edition for Jeffreys was not properly appreciated. But how I clasped Wood Magic or After London, sitting on an open bus top while going down to Ealing or up to Islington to persuade Messrs. Crawford Price or Mr. Fred Varley that really the advertisement for the house for auction should appear in the Times instead of the Daily Telegraph, despite my conviction that the Telegraph was the better medium for such suburban properties. Once I had tried flattery, but bluff old Mr. Varley had cried out, They'll see Fred Varley in the Times and wonder what's happened." And as he gave me an order for 6 insertions of his name, telephone number and address in our Auctioneers and Land Agents Register, which appeared every Saturday, he said that as he did that. Yeah, I've got it. I thought I'd been clever, but now as I drove along in the stream of cars all hurrying to London, I knew that Mr. Varley had been kind to an obviously struggling ex-officer trying to do a job which he was probably unsuited for and certainly inexperienced. Strange days. Then the sudden shift from Lord Northcliffe's Times to his Weekly Dispatch as a motoring editor. I got this job after showing the editor an essay in the style of Jeffreys entitled Meadow Grasses. I half hoped he would print it on the front page as the chief news item or splash. But after glancing at it, extremely carelessly, I thought. He tossed it aside and said, "So the chief has sent you here, has he? Well, what do you want for your motoring column?" I said I'd leave it up to him, and I got the lowest rate, 3 guineas a column. Thus my journalist career started, and all I had ever heard about cars was put into that weekly column, or half column as it soon became. When I was bare of ideas, I invented correspondence. Thus, one was replied to, "Your leaking radiator can temporarily be cured by the introduction of oatmeal, which will thicken and stop the leak, as well as providing a warm meal on a winter's night." After further similar advice, the half column became a quarter column, and then disappeared altogether. Those days seemed far away, yet only just out of reach. With a slight shock, I realised that I was now older than Richard Jefferies when he died, and older than Edward Thomas, killed at Vimy in 1917. I was their senior. I had learnt more than they knew, judged by the length of time on this earth. The joy and the excitement on getting my first Jefferies Green Fern Farm. The back of the binding was broken, but his device of a wind-flowered leaf was in gold leaf on the cover. Perhaps he had handled that very copy in the office of Smith, Elder and Co., the publishers. That day, nearly every auctioneer I visited in Holloway, Hampstead and Highgate was shown the copy and told about the wonders of the spirit behind the prose. The queer thing was that advertisements began to come in, especially when I didn't mention them. I found out that one man was a fly fisherman, so I sent him some cuttings from the Times, without a letter or without mentioning my name, just the cuttings. I avoided his office, and something came in later on from his firm. So I sat about in public parks, writing my first novel, and didn't bother them any more. A few weeks later, I was a motoring editor, and a few weeks after that, the articles ceased to be printed, and I quit Fleet Street and went down to Devon on my motorbike in the rain. There was no Great West Road in those days, with its cliffs and pinnacles of illuminated white factories sliding past the eyes of the intent, speeding motorist. Today this was a dangerous road. Cars raced 3 abreast, cutting over the white line, and sometimes meeting another trio travelling the opposite way. I found myself one of 3 and dropped back. I would not compete with the commercial travellers in their closed American cars, which anyway could accelerate faster than I could, though they would be on the scrap heap 2 or 3 times before the Silver Eagle joined them. I was 40 years of age. What was I going to do with myself? Jefferies had been unread for years. I knew it all now. That was the trouble. In those 20 books were all I knew. I had emptied myself out into them. 1,000,000 brain cell impressions had gone out of my head into words, and it seemed my life was finished. What was I doing? Sitting in this car, turning into the glaring and metallic mass of movement of Hammersmith Broadway. I had left Devon because there was nothing to do with myself down there. Day after day was the same, walking to the Deer Park Bridge, staring at the flood waters, walking up the river bank, seeing the spraints of the otter, who always touched by the big ant-hill, seeing the same old heron rising with leisurely alarm 300 yards upriver to beat his wide grey wings to the oak trees at the bottom of Brembridge Hill, watching in the treetop until I had gone back again the way I'd come. No stimulation left in the valley. All the excitement of staring at salmon and discovering about them and the river was in Solaire, I don't know what that is, My life there was a closed book. It lived and would live, I knew that. But for the life in that book of my life... My life there was a closed book. It lived and would live, I knew that. For the life in that book was my life, which had gone out of me. As usual, the arrival at the Barbarian Club. Yeah, Barbarian Club. I don't know where that is. As usual, the arrival at the Barbarian Club was an anticlimax. I could not mix properly with the men at the bar. I wanted to, but there was a difference I felt between us. Our worlds were different. They were always pleasant, and I liked them, but I couldn't feel myself going out to them. They were townsmen, and I was, most parts, a countryman. This was the same in the country. Among countrymen I was part townsman. The man I felt freest, happiest with was dead a few months before, killed in a motorcycle accident. He had written of his life in the RAF under an assumed name. I liked these fellows enormously. We are really the same kind of creature, or would have been, if I'd had a natural life and not a mort of experience, and the nearer I can creep back towards them, the safer I feel. They give one root in the ground. I sat in the bar of the Barbican Club, wondering what to do with myself. 200 miles of fast motoring, and this is what I'd come up for, to drink a pint of beer that I didn't want and just sit around. And the nearer I can creep back towards them. How often had one been asked the question, why had Lawrence joined the Air Force, and the questioner not listened to the answer? I'm assuming these are references to people that were known at the time, because I don't know who this Lawrence bloke is, who was an RAF who killed, who is quoting, but I don't know who that is. But I assume that when this was published, people would have known. So why had Lawrence joined the Air Force, and the questioner not listened to the answer? They had always thought that he was different from themselves, that their hopes and fears and inner selves were inferior to his, and so they thought of him as different. That can't be Lawrence of Arabia, can it, surely? Even now, in the broken temples of his brain were 6 months in the darkness of tree roots. Some of these journalists and scenario writers thought the accident was a put-up job on the Secret Service. So I don't know who is this Lawrence? Is this Lawrence of Arabia? It might be. He's talking about somebody called Lawrence who joined the RAF. I think Lawrence of Arabia did come back and join the RAF, actually. I think this is Lawrence. What's his real name? Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence, I've got the bloody book here. D.H. Lawrence, isn't it? Which Lawrence? This isn't Lawrence who wrote the... what's his name? There's two Lawrences, isn't there? There's the Lawrence who wrote the Lady Chatterley's Lover. That's not the one. Which Lawrence is this one? I've forgotten now. Why doesn't it tell me his sodding name? You just Lawrence of Arabia, yeah, but T.E. Thank you, T.E. Lawrence. There we go. I think I think he did join the RAF, and I think he must have died in some way. Anyway, I think that's who he's quoting. It's gone into a bit of a reverie here. I supposed I should sit there for another hour and then go into the supper room, then go to the talkies. I liked talkies and secretly envied those scenario writers and journalists who knew film stars intimately and who went to gay parties. And by gay parties, he doesn't... Yes. In the talkies, I could forget myself and live in the sparkle and space of beauty, gaiety and life. I'll get in early this time and not have to stand at the back as I usually did. Yet I stayed in the bar, drinking beer I didn't want, while the smoke thickened and the laughter grew louder. Then, "You're wanted on the telephone, sir," said the page boy in my ear. "Hello," said the voice of Dick, my publisher. "Come and dine, won't you? We'd love to see you. Tomorrow we're going to Norfolk to stay for a few days in the cottage. Won't you come too?" 10 minutes later I was drinking sherry in his Gower Street house, holding out my hands to the blaze of his fire and feeling happy to be there. Chapter 2. Oh, Lawrence of Arabia died in a motorbike accident. Oh, well, he died in a motorbike. Well, maybe that's what he's talking about here. What does he say here? Why had Lawrence joined the Air Force? The question, they always thought he was different from themselves, that hopes and fears, even now, somewhere in here, he said, oh, I was freest, happiest, and he was dead a few months before, killed in a motorbike accident. There we go. He had written of his life in the RAF under an assumed name. Oh yeah, so yeah, because I mean, I've got this thick book I've got about Lawrence of Arabia, which is so thick. I mean, a lot of it is to do with him not infiltrating, but being with the Arabs. He loved the Arabs and he dressed as the Arabs and all the rest of it. But I have to confess, I never really finished it. It just seemed to go on and on. I mean, it's a huge, great tome. It just seemed to have too much detail for me to hold in my head. Did he not die on an aerial Square 4 and a Vincent Black Shadow? I don't know. Yes, he was an aircraft man in the RAF, Lawrence of Arabia. Yeah, there we go. So I thought it might have been him that he was mentioning and quoting. Anyway, chapter 2, I revisit old scenes. Now that I had an objective, something to look forward to, I was in no hurry to leave London. Dick suggested that we should all go to Norfolk together in his large closed car. I pleaded engagements in Fleet Street and asked if I may come on to him a few days later. Of course, he said, and I felt relief that I had no need to do anything immediately. For 2 days I enjoyed myself in London, talking with acquaintances and friends, once in the Café Cosmopolitan, and swearing after the visit that I would never go to the place again. And then I got my bag and leather coat and helmet and set off across London to the Seven Sisters Road and the exit by Epping Forest. I was well pleased with life. The book about the salmon had sold 10,000 copies between October publishing and the Christmas just past, and it was still selling. It had been exhausting to write, and I'd had to cut it short, every word being chipped from the breastbone. All the while I'd been writing it, all the while I had been writing it too, the thought had haunted me that it might be a flop, and then Dick would lose the £750 he'd given to me to do it. A whole book about a fish. Who would read it? So painfully detailed, so matter-of-fact, the descriptions of water, stone, moss, waves, currents and trees. Thank God I hadn't let him down. The book had earned about the 750 before Christmas, and now was selling slightly but steadily. I could not face writing another book just yet, although I had a grand subject in a part of England unknown to me, where I must live at least a year to get the local feelings and facts. I was pleased with myself that I was driving quietly, without impatience. There was much traffic out of London, and I kept my place, driving on the engine and not on the brakes. The sun was shining. The Silver Eagle was polished. I'd done it myself that morning. So, without hurry, and yet quickly, it seemed, I was turning into the main road to Epping and Chelmsford. Nearly 24 years ago, I'd come along this way on a bicycle, a schoolboy setting out alone to reach the Norfolk coast, where, in a small fishing village, my mother and sisters were staying for August and part of September. I recalled the roads of those days, untarred and dusty, with cart ruts in places, hardened off and flattened by other wheels. I was cycling along when I noticed a man behind me, on a bike with very low handlebars. A type of machine which I regarded, without actually formulating the thought, as belonging to a bad companion. A bad companion was something I was afraid of. I had been warned of bad companions by my mother before I left London. The man following me had a dark moustache with pointed ends. He wore cycling knickerbockers, I noticed, as I turned round hastily to get a glimpse of him. He was a sinister figure, obviously. Why was he following me? A kidnapper? I pedalled on, fast. I got into top gear. It was a new bicycle with 3 speeds, and I thrust my hardest. Oh, horror! The man with the dark moustache and pointed cycling shoes was just behind me, his front wheel almost touching mine. I freewheeled and then slowed up. When I dared another backward glance, he was still there, now pedalling slowly, as I was. Soon I stopped, pretending to feel the back tyre. He stopped too. I was just getting you to pace me, he said. Oh, I heard myself saying. Going far? Perhaps if I told him I was going to stay the night somewhere on the road, he might not follow me. He might not follow me and perhaps rob me. I had 8 shillings in my purse. His eyes were close together. I must be careful. Oh, just out for a spin. I'm practising for a race, he said. And if you don't object, I'd like to keep by your wheel for a mile or 2. I belong to the Waltham Wanderers, and we have a road race with the Romford Rovers next Saturday. Oh, I see. I'll pace you after a bit if you like. This he did for a mile. I tried to keep my front wheel an inch off his back wheel rim as he instructed me. Unfortunately, I touched his wheel and fell off, scraping hand and knee. Instead of standing me a ginger beer and afterwards... he insisted on standing me a ginger beer and afterwards went back saying that he worked at a hotel and it was time to get back to the kitchen for lunch. So, to my relief, I found myself alone again. I was happiest when I was alone. That August of 1912 was hot. The trees growing by the wayside had dusty leaves. Occasionally a motor car, about 2 an hour, chugged towards me, leaving a thick fog of dust behind. But none overtook my trusty Swift 3-speeder. I passed brick and timber cottages with damson trees growing in the gardens. A boy dressed in a dark blue Norfolk suit and breeches, stockings and brown shoes, very thin and bony. My ambition was to stay at school for always. Not that I'd liked school, but My ambition was to stay at school for always. Not that I liked school, but because I wanted always to be able to be in the country and watch birds. I wanted to be a farmer, vaguely, if I must be something. The picture of myself as farmer was always the same and very simple. Wandering with a gun under my arm, slowly, meditatively, across a field as the sun was setting. I suppose I'd be after rabbits, though the gun was always under my arm, and I was thinking of boyhood days gone forever. I was 15 and still sang treble in the school choir. This February morning I went into Chelmsford in search of memories of my young cycling self, but the place was unrecognisable with its chain stores and cinemas and traffic. It was a Londonised country town, and I went on to Colchester, recognising with a start the obelisk I had stared at as a boy and noted in my diary to Royalists shot by General Fairfax in 1648. After lunch of bread and cheese and homemade pickled onions with beer in a small pub, I went on, having noted that a few miles away was the village where I had, on that bicycle journey, watched my first otter hunt. I thought I would go and see the mill and the reedy water where I had lingered on that summer day so long ago. For 2 hours the new bike had lain against a haystack covered with wisps of hay, against thieves, while I had wandered about on the bank's sand, watched, with others, red and blue uniformed men cracking whips, wet hounds running about, baying, while the huntsman blew short notes on a little copper horn. I didn't see the animal they were hunting, but only the strings of bubbles rising from the dark water as the unseen beast crossed from one reed bed to another. I had talk with a miller, whose hat and face and shoulders were covered with flour, and he told me about the otter and how it could breathe under water just as well as on land. He said it went in the winter deep into the mud and lay there asleep in the with the swallow. What? It lay there asleep with the swallows, which also disappeared in the autumn. I told him that swallows went to Africa. I don't believe it, he said. And can you prove it? Well, I said, there was a cigarette card series just out then, 52 birds of the British Isles, and on the back was one of the swallow, and he would find the information printed on it. Not him, he replied. He didn't smoke, or drink either, as both were sinful things. I didn't find what he said very interesting and went back to look at the hunting, though very soon it also became uninteresting, and I looked for old nests, old, alas, now that the spring was gone forever, in the bushes of an islet, and I found a bullfinch with one addled egg, but cracked. It was no good. I had never found a bullfinch's before, though of course the old nest with an addled egg, even unchipped, and capable of being blown and washed, wasn't the same as finding a real bullfinch. Was this the mill? This sombre, shut-up semi-ruin beside the road? I sat in the car, wondering if I should get out. Wasn't I being rather silly, stopping by an old mill which had served its day? What was the good of going back into the past, and a 2-hour past of a small boy cycling to a fishing village on a Norfolk coast? This faded brick building, what did it mean to me, really? The whole history of England, of the world, of nature, was change and decay and new growth. The windows were no longer even a target for small boys' stones, and someone had whitewashed a crude device on the door with the words, "Stand by the King." This was probably done in the days before the abdication of Edward VIII. It seemed a pity that all the old watermills were becoming derelict, and that the old-fashioned home-grown wheaten loaf was no longer to be bought, except in special places, perhaps in the West End of London. The modern milling processes removed the valuable golden skin of the wheat berry, and the white flour left was almost without feeding value. Most of the mills were at ports, handy for grinding corn, which came from America, Australia, and the Argentine. Someone had told me that the poor teeth of most working-class children today were due to the lime on the fields, and also to the white flour, which, as an experiment at Cambridge, had shown that rats, fed on it exclusively for 3 months, had died of various diseases, all brought on by malnutrition. I allowed myself one more meditative look back at the small red brick inn at Scole, halfway between Ipswich and Norwich. Here at the end of the day's cycling I had swung my leg over the saddle and glided to the open door. Could I have a bed for the night? On the advice of a cyclist I had paced that morning, I asked to see the bedroom, and while the landlady stood there, I turned back the sheets. Why did I do that? She asked. I was abashed. I didn't like to say that I'd been advised to do this to see if the bed was clean. She was amused at my silence and asked me if I would like some supper. I was too excited by the strangeness of my adventure and the long ride in the sun and the dust of the harvest day to be hungry, but I said yes, and she showed me to the kitchen and asked if a plate of cold pork would suit me. She was a kindly soul, and she called me Sonny. What would I like to drink? She inquired, standing by the table. I asked for cider. The house had only cider on tap, she said. That's what I like. I'll have a pint, I said, remembering the cask in the cellar at home, which I used to drink when my father was not about. Sitting alone at the table, while from the next room, which was the bar, a sort of roar of talk and laughter came to me with the smell of rank tobacco, and I ate my pork and sipped my cider. I was more hungry than I thought, and ate with relish. After a while I found the room was going round, and I could not eat any more of the pork. The smell of the smoke and the noise had made me giddy. Perhaps I had sunstroke and didn't know it, I thought, and went outside to the passage and groped my way upstairs to the bedroom. There I had an awful sensation that I was going to be sick, and lay down on the bed. But it didn't get worse, and I must have gone to sleep to the shouted harvest talk below in the bar, for when I awoke the moon was very white beyond the window, and all was quiet. I was still in my clothes and undressing. I got between the sheets and woke to the sun shining on the wallpaper. I got up and after a wash and breakfast asked for the bill. I don't want any paying, Sonny, said the woman. I'll be pleased to do it for nothing. But I must pay you. Please, I cried, and thereupon worked out a sum for her approval. The cider, 2d, the pork, 4d, the room, a shilling, and breakfast, 9d. Would that do? Yes, anything you like, dear, she replied, and counting out 2 sixpences, a shilling, and 3 pennies from my purse, I thanked her and rode away on my swift. 24 years ago. The journey from Scole, which they pronounced school, to Norwich must have taken me at least 2 hours. But this time I'd done it in 22 minutes, averaging about 50 miles an hour. The road was open and nearly straight all the way, and this was not hogging it. I stopped for tea at Norwich, which I thought a pleasant country town, in a modestly quiet sort of way, and then set out in the twilight for Cromer and Dick's cottage in the fishing village beyond. Whither I arrived and found a warm fire in the hearth, towards which it was good to stretch my feet and my whither, I never quite understand what whither means, but anyway, whither I arrived and found a warm fire in a brick hearth, towards which it was good to stretch my cold feet. A whisky and soda was put into my hand, and a cigarette, and I lay relaxed in a chair, the glass tilted lazily on the chair arm. Even so, I found myself regarding this comfort and stimulation not as wholly right. Why did I need whisky, which I seldom drink, and the inner faint objection to relaxation? Why was this? Why was it right to be so comfortable when most people on the earth existed in circumstances which were a disgrace to anyone with imagination? There were so few people to plead for them, to work for them, for a fuller life, which only could be realised when the economic fabric was the concern of all. A remote but insistent voice within me was always crying that there was work to be done, that most of my talent had been buried in indolence and selfishness, while outside was the rain and the cold and the battlefields of the world awaiting every generation until by a struggle and triumph the creative will, the new world, should be born. Soon the whisky was thickeningly warming me within, and I was content to lie there talking idly. I told Dick that I felt that I had outgrown Devon, and I was not living any more myself. I was entirely without hope of writing any book about the West Country. During the past 2 or 3 years this feeling had been petrifying within me. Also the family was growing up. There would be a big change in England, a revolutionary change. Half the European countries were in the process of altering their entire conception of economic and physical life, an evolutionary process which was not properly understood in complacent, mature England. Maturity was a kind of death and preceded decay. Always in histories, wars had come out of this condition. Decadence and resurgence, one had followed the other, a natural law. Likewise, in family or personal life, the same law held. Families rose up through the virility or drive of one man. They maintained themselves and continued in power, or they ceased to work and disappeared. I had an old Devon book of the middle 18th century with names of land-owning families, which were now called country families. Six out of eight of them had disappeared in less than 200 years. Their names didn't even exist among the labourers. Some great families remained, holding their estates, but only because each generation maintained itself by work, otherwise called service. Since the rise of industrialism in England, the power had been going from the landlords and was now in the industrial interests. Banks and insurance companies had mortgages on land. They foreclosed and became landowners. The next phase was selling the land and investing the money abroad, and this made a better return. Meanwhile, for a long period, the fertility of English land had been slowly diminishing, until today it produced half of what it produced at the beginning of the 20th century, when for 50 years or more it had been declining. White bread. What was white bread? It had first been made when the peasants had flocked to the towns and factories to get better wages in the new prosperity which came when England started to sell its factory products to the rest of the world. The white bread came about because the yellow-grey whole wheat berry was said by the townspeople, sons and daughters of the uprooted peasants, to be dirty. So millers began to adulterate the flour and make it clean, or white. Some bleached it, adding plaster of Paris. All kinds of adulterations followed. Then came a law against it. Meanwhile, cheap corn was coming in from the ploughed-up prairies of America and Canada, and from Russia and Central Europe, in exchange for factory goods and machinery sold there. Energetic businessmen erected mills at the ports and got machinery to skin the wheat, thus making a nice white flour for nice white bread. The valuable yellow skins were called offals and were fed to the pigs and cattle. Little children in towns, poor waifs, had rotten teeth in consequence. I was not easy while I was holding forth like this. I had a feeling I was boring, a ranter, an impotent revolutionary. For years I'd been talking about such things, as they were a consuming interest to me, but of course I had a crank, as boat builders said of a sailing ship which kept veering off its course through ill balance or misshape, or some unknown cause. Oh well, England's all right. We muddle through somehow and come out on top in the end, and the usual intolerant summing up upon such. Oh well, England's all right. We muddle through somehow and come out on top in the end was the usual tolerant summing up upon such tirades. Sometimes one was guilty of bad form in speaking of such things. 16 million people in Britain permanently undernourished, 50 million starving in the Empire, the intelligences of children subdued in schools, their minds fed on white intellectualism. These and 1,000 other conditions apparently were the basis of good social form. "There's a windmill near us where wheat is ground for flour and is baked in the village bakehouse," said Dick's wife, adding, "I wonder if you'd like a living in Norfolk. It would be a complete change, of course. The air is dry and hard after the soft, relaxing atmosphere of Devon. There are lots of birds here to watch, geese and shore waders. Dick, shall we take him to see Old Castle at Creek, which is now empty, or would that be too large, do you think?" "I wonder," said Dick. "It's been empty for a long time and it's for sale. You would be able to buy it very cheaply. A lovely Elizabethan house with turrets and a ruin. I wonder if he would like it. There's a river through the grounds with trout in it. In fact, if it wasn't for having to go to work in London and being so inaccessible, I think we would have thought about it for ourselves." The word inaccessible roused my interest. Shore waders, trout stream. "Quite big trout too," said Dick. 2-pounders are common, I believe. It's a chalk stream. Let's have a look at it tomorrow. And look at it, shall we? Sorry, let's take him tomorrow and look at it, shall we? You'll be able to see a fine new coastal view over the marshes and perhaps see some wild geese. There's a ghost, I believe, but that will probably add to the attraction. And so we're on chapter 3. I explore a historic house. I think he's slowly getting the idea. He wants to buy something in Norfolk. Well, anyway, I'm going to leave it there. We've done 2 chapters. What did you make of that? I found that quite interesting. I know I cocked up a few times. I've lost my little spacer. Where's my little spacer? I hope you managed to get, as he was flitting from his boyhood to the present day. I hope that wasn't too... Oh, great. I hope that wasn't too confusing and that you managed to sort of work that bit out when he was talking about his schoolhood. Interesting about the white flower, I thought. That was fascinating. Let's have a quick look at your comments before we go. Let's have a look. Talking about Dorniers, the trick when Dorniers, when they started chasing, is not to run away, rather to make yourself look big. I thought Dornier was a German plane, and if it should get you, grab its propeller and bite hard to show its boss. I don't think you can really actually do that. There's a nice photo of you sitting on it, Ernie. Mark Dunby had not good for the teeth. Hurricanes would be better if they were canvas and wood frame. Okay, talking about aircraft. Best to be talking about... the book is... Right, Turbo Stream. This book is flowing nicely along, much easier to listen to the cack-handed one. Isn't it ironic? Brown bread, white bread. Now brown bread is all the rage once again. That's because we know it's healthier, says Mike Stevens. I have a confession. I like white bread. That's true. Nice readings. Interesting book. This book rattles along. The other one was a bit turgid. Yes, I think I like this book. Well read. Thank you. LOL. I like white bread too, although when I was pregnant with Joseph, I loved seeded bread. A first for me. Best to just think of talking to friends and not a lot of scary eyes inspecting every word. Well, I know that in the last book, of course, Linda Kane was reading every word with me because she had a copy of the book. So if I paraphrased, I could feel where I'd gone wrong. I think once we get into the business about buying the farm and the problems that he has in the farm, I think that would be, just getting into where he is. But we'll see how we progress anyway. I live in Norfolk, says David Kitchen. So there we go. Well, we'll have I should think as it gets going. Narrowboat, chalk streams south of England. Yes, but there is a lot of there's a lot of chalk in Norfolk, isn't there? Because there's a lot of flint in Norfolk, especially in those old churches. That's something that I knew about but forgot. When Kevin Hall and I went and did our we were there for about 4 days in Norfolk, and we did a tour of some old churches and things in Norfolk, near Norwich, in the Broads, on the Norfolk Broads. We saw all the chalk. We saw all the flint. So presumably, where flint is, there's chalk, I assume. Enjoying the book today. Good story. Well done, Richard. You are hard on yourself sometimes. I am. It's true. I'm enjoying this book. You seem to be a bit more comfortable with it. Yeah, I do. He's a bit more of an easier writer to sort of get into the rhythm of, and that's the important thing. And I think once, as we get going, I don't like the fact that this page is falling out, but there we are. Yeah, it should be good. There's some pictures. There's some pictures in the book which I'll show you tomorrow. Really, here's a scarecrow. But as he gets towards the farm, becoming a farmer, we'll see it. Anyway, there we go. Linda Kane says, no, I wasn't actually. Oh, you said you were, and that's what I had my image of you, Linda, going, oh, yes, no, he's got that one wrong. That's not quite right. That's hey-ho. Recently, I saw a documentary, says Mark, saying that the peasants of England ate better than the gentry and the Romans, and the Romans brought a lot of new foods like rabbit, vine leaves, and ducks, and some herbs. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Indeed. That and other people made bread with things beside wheat flour, like rice flour. Not much nutrition in that. Oh, God, yeah, no. Can you imagine? Ben Reeves says, Weaverley next door, RAF Benson in Oxfordshire, still has its watercress beds in the chalk streams, if I remember rightly. Oh, lovely. Well, there we go. It's coming out at 5 o'clock. What's today? Thursday, isn't it? We'll read again. What was the author? The author is Henry Williamson, who wrote Tarka the Otter. Don't get confused with Ring of Brightwater, which is a different one, different author. Yes, Richard's hard too hard about himself and his reading. Even professional readers make mistakes. Few have the guts to do it live for that reason. Well, I suppose that's very true, I guess. Anyway, it worked. You could pretty much work out what I was getting to. So I do feel better about this one. The Scarecrow looked a musical conductor, yes. Jaden Kowalski, hello to you. Only looking to see how much was left out of the early edition. Well, that was interesting, what you looked at there, Linda, when I realised that the other one was an abridged version. So that was interesting. No, I didn't really mind. I mean, I'm sure, people can read along with me. And one is always going to slightly paraphrase and get out of a muddle. I mean, sometimes when I'm reading, I realise I've said something wrong, or I've put a couple of words arse about face, and but you can sometimes get out of it, and sometimes just the words. It's when there's a series of little words, not the longer words. They're all right, really. It's the little words. They're all tightly together, and there's a. I did this in a way that which, and you're reading that. I did this in a way that which meant that I could do, and you'll go. I can't get the flow. Whereas when there's bigger words, you've got more time to read it. But when there's a series of little words all in time, I did this in a way which enabled me to. I did this in. Oh, I see it. It's sometimes just working out that flow can take it makes a brain freeze for a moment. So there we go. Anyway, that's it. Good choice. Enjoying the book. Thank you, Lee. Very pleased. Have a good evening. No Vogue show tonight. Looking forward to coming back and reading a bit more because I actually enjoyed that. So, yeah, there we go. catch up with you tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed the wild flowers on the video today. That was fascinating to see those. And tomorrow, what is tomorrow? I got a video. Oh yeah, tomorrow not quite so interesting, but we'll see how you go. Or from that Batman film with Christian Bale. Okay, now you've lost me. Wurzel played. Oh yes, the British series was played by John Pertwee, who was brilliant as Wurzel Gummidge. Bye, Richard. Have a nice day. Don't worry that you missed it. Okie dokie. Thank you very much. I will catch up with you soon. I'm going to go and light the SE now and sort out some dinner for myself. Take care. Lovely to see you. See you the same time, same channel tomorrow. Ta-ta for now.